much. So we came to Beijing in order to unstick what has been stuck for almost a year, and that's the in-person dialogue between the United States and China. And indeed, we did succeed in having long and very detailed meetings with a lot to catch up on. We had very frank conversations, but we came here to break new ground, which we think is important at this stage, and it is clear that we are going to need a little more work to be able to complete that task, which we still believe, both of us, is doable. There are a lot of things that we very clearly agreed on after all this time. But there are also some issues that are going to have to be resolved that are going to take a little more time. We used as a baseline for this meeting the meeting that took place between President Biden and President Xi in Bali, Indonesia, where the two leaders agreed to work jointly and together with other countries to address the climate crisis. We both agreed to continue bilateral engagement to address this climate crisis, and we both agreed as a matter of urgency and in recognition of the global and existential nature of this threat. We both agreed to continue this bilateral effort, particularly agreeing on the language that we are deeply disturbed by the current urgency that grows by the day and because of the global and existential nature of this challenge. We are both deeply alarmed by the best available science and the findings. We also agreed that we agree with the scientific findings, including the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, recognizing that the climate crisis has increasingly affected people and countries around the world. We both remain committed to fully implementing the U.S.-China joint statement addressing the climate crisis and the U.S.-China joint Glasgow declaration on enhancing climate action in the 2020s. And we both agreed that we want to work together to guarantee a positive pinpointing the time for our next meeting, any outcome. So we also agreed to work intensively in the weeks ahead. This is not a one-off meeting. We are already pinpointing the time for our next meeting, and then even the next one after that, recognizing that we have only about 4 months before the COP, and we have to make up a certain amount of time for the period that this discussion has not been taking place. We agreed to work intensively on those meetings and to set goals and make sure that we have a work product that has jumped through the hoops in both of our countries so that it can be approved and we can move forward. We agreed in the next weeks that our next meeting will take place, and among the topics to discuss will be the scaling and integrating of renewable energy into a power sector in order to be able to reduce coal emissions, and also to address non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, including to inform the development of 2035 NDCs that are supposed to be submitted in 2025. And we view this as a very important discussion, which took a fair amount of time in the course of these days. So that's the basic outline of where we are, and I'm happy to take a few questions.
The first question comes from Keith Retcher of New York Times. According to People's Daily this morning, Xi Jinping said in a speech this week that China's path and tempo to its carbon targets, quote, should be and must be determined by ourselves and never under the sway of others, unquote. Do you interpret that as pushback to your message this week? And what are the consequences if China does not act at a faster pace, particularly on coal? Thank you.
Well, I think we all agree that nobody should be, quote, dictated to. And we're not doing that. That's why we had 3 days of intensive discussions. And I think if you ask Xi Jinping, he'll tell you there was zero dictation. Nor, I think if you asked Director Wang Yi and Vice President Han, as well as any of the interlocutors we were talking to, they would tell you that there was no dictation here. There was a clear exchange of ideas. If anything is dictating, it is the science. All of us should be informed by and compelled by the level of the science that is coming back at a more rapid rate by the day. I think it was 52 degrees. I mentioned that to Premier Lee. And we're seeing all around the world records being broken at a record pace. So all of us need to be engaged and really motivated as a consequence of that.
The next question comes from Ms. Wang Lu from the paper.
Thank you. I'm from the paper. Given the worldwide high temperature days, how the two sides can manage differences, eliminate interference, and work together to address the climate crisis more practically. And I also want to know what consensus has been reached with China on COP28. Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was the last one?
What consensus has been reached with China on COP28?
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that I partly answered the first part of your question, but the key here, folks, is really cooperating and working together. There's no way any one country is going to win this battle by itself. It just can't happen. No government has enough money to be able to effect this transition by itself. In the end, we have to get the private sector, philanthropies, governments. Everybody has to come together. And we have to accelerate almost everything we're all doing. We have to accelerate the research and development. We have to accelerate the deployment of new technologies. We have to be able to speed up what we know works, which is particularly renewables. And you're seeing in many countries, in the United States as well as in other countries, that 95%, 75, 80% of all the new electricity coming online is now coming from renewable energy. So we're in the beginning of a revolution, and the challenge for all of us is, can we effect this transition at a rapid enough pace that we are living up to the challenge of the science? The scientists who have told us today that they are terrified by the evidence they see coming back faster than they predicted, and declaring that we are in uncharted water. Well, if we are indeed in uncharted water, we all need to check our compasses and check our charts and make sure we are making the decisions that are necessary to winning this battle. And you can't just push it off to the side. It's not something you can put on hold, because it's unfolding at its own pace, like a living organism, which in effect, we put up into the atmosphere, and no matter what we do or think, take a day off, take a week off, it's still going to be moving at the same pace, if not faster, because we're continuing to feed the engine of that problem, which is emissions from fossil fuels that are not being trapped and captured and utilized. The second part of your question was the...
How about the consensus on the COP28?
Yeah. I think we're in great agreement that, China and the United States played a role. President Obama came here to China. And in 2014, to meet with President Xi, they stood up and declared what the mutual efforts would be between China and the United States, and then went on to Paris. And Paris was successful, not exclusively because of that, but it contributed to that effort. And the same thing needs to happen now. We need to guarantee that COP is successful. And we are both supportive of the efforts of the COP presidency. We're both looking for what happens that will further this faster, but we're working in conjunction with the UAE, which has been working, believe me, exceedingly hard around the world now, listening and working with interested parties around the world. We'll continue to do that.
Next from Jen DeLuey from Bloomberg.
Thank you. There are Americans who will say that you came to China for 3 days of talks and are only leaving with a plan for more of them. What is the framework to actually resolve some of these most contentious issues around finance, around the pace in phasing out fossil fuels in the weeks ahead?
Well, you've got to be mindful of the fact that we have not been talking because we were suspended for a long period of time. And we've practically not practically, we've had no in-person meetings since last August. We're now in mid-July of another year. So I think, we did the wise thing, which is make sure that what we're holding out to folks as a step forward is indeed a step forward. That we're not just putting words on paper, and you'll notice we're not issuing a declaration together because we're not finished finding the pathway with clarity on both sides that will allow us to achieve what we need to achieve. But this is how you get business done. You begin somewhere. You begin those talks. You move the process forward. And I assure you that both Xi Jinping, my counterpart, and I, and my whole team are convinced that we move things in that discussion forward. But there are bureaus and agencies of our governments that need to feed in to that process. We don't just operate in a vacuum here, and we need to be sure that whether it's the EPA or the Energy Department, or whether here it's the Ministry of Environment, the MEE, or one other department, that people are moving in the same direction. And that takes leadership and time. But we don't have a lot of time, so that's why we're going to try to work on an accelerated schedule.
Valerie from Reuters.
Could you pinpoint a couple of the areas where you've had most difficulty, or there was maybe the first areas that required more talks and extra attention? I think
the question of coal is a difficult one in China, obviously, and the fact is that China has reduced the impact of some emissions by virtue of its rapid, very large deployment of renewables. China is deploying literally several thousand gigawatts of renewable energy and has deployed already more renewable energy than I think most of the rest of the countries in the world put together. And the question now is to shift from some of the coal dependency, where we believe there may be some excess capacity, and maybe there are ways to work together to try to help make that kind of transition occur faster. That's an area of discussion. Certainly the area of including all greenhouse gases in your efforts, we believe is very important. We're talking about that, and that will continue to be a subject of conversation. Methane being one of those gases, which is 20 to 80 times more damaging than CO2. So we're focused on that. So really it was a question of how do we implement faster. That requires coordination with other agencies and other entities. And one of the things we didn't want to do is just put out a piece of paper that isn't going to result in action. Let me give you an example. In Glasgow, we made commitments regarding regarding the Kigali Agreement implementation. We made commitments regarding stopping coal finance, which China agreed to do, and also to put forward our long-term strategies and to publish them so that people could see what we're doing. We did all three of those things. That was real. And what we want to make sure is that what we're saying now can be real because people are really bought in to the process. And that takes a little bit more time than impatient people like me like.
Last question from Ms. Chang Xu from CCTV.
Yeah, thank you. This is CMG speaking. And we got a chart from Statistic, and it is known that China has the world's largest capacity of renewable energy.
Yes,
so
indeed.
the cooperation between China and the U.S. should be closer. And in your opinion, what should the two sides do to improve the cooperation? And will the sanctions from your other department continue to hinder the cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as I said, I already acknowledged that China has been literally remarkable in the degree to which they've been able to deploy renewable energy in both solar and wind particularly. They lead the world in that regard. But at the same time, China is also building new coal-fired power plants that are unabated, and that's a challenge. So how do we sort of mix and match those things to move in a different direction? I know China is concerned about the sale of some of those products. That issue was raised with me, and it's my responsibility to go back and pass on those concerns to our government in full, and I will do that. And people, believe me, are well aware of some of those constraints that exist today. But I'm not responsible at all in my track, which is climate, for some of the inputs to those concerns. And believe me, people are working at that. Secretary Yellen was here working on that. Secretary Tony Blinken was here working on that. And hopefully that track will provide progress while those of us on this track also try to contribute our fair share. I promised Lisa we'd get a question here. Can I do that?
Okay.
You got to kick me out of here? Is that...
Of course, I'm not going to kick you out, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. You don't regret it.
Oh, I will? Okay. Thanks, everybody. That was good. Sorry.
McCarthy has said that he is going to visit Taiwan, that it is just a matter of timing. Given how long it's taken to restart talks on climate change with China after Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, do you think he should go?
I'm not going to get in. Taiwan, again, is a different track. It's not, my role to be commenting on that particular track, and I don't want to add to what is already a very complicated challenge. Obviously, everybody's got to kind of take a deep breath and look at what the meaning is and how we proceed forward. One thing I will reiterate, because we have constantly said this when I was Secretary of State, and many years before that and many years since, we support, and it's not rhetoric, we support the One China policy. We support the communiques, 3 communiques. We support the 6 assurances. And Taiwan knows full well what President Biden's position is with respect to any efforts towards independence. So obviously, I don't want to comment more except to say that we all hope nothing will get in the way of our ability to deal with the climate crisis, because as I said previously, it doesn't wait for these things. It is not something that you can just sort of say, okay, stop while we're doing something else and we'll come back to you. It's going to continue. And the climate issue is not a bilateral issue in our judgment. President Biden believes, as I think most of the world does, that the climate crisis is a universal threat to humankind. And we all have a responsibility to deal with it as rapidly as we can. And we hope we will leave other issues to the side so that something that is of concern that more and more people in the world who are being dislocated, who have food shortages, who have water challenges, who can't work in the heat, can't live in the heat. These are, no country can turn its back on that for any period of time. And that's our feeling from the climate side about how we need to respond to it. I think we're all set.
Thank you,
all
everyone.
very, very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.